she'll tell me where to start, and I trust my heart enough to follow through.
Hello, welcome to Community Currency. I'm Carol Bruyere, and today we have a show entitled Coup de 12, the enterprise that brought the presidency, with Dr. David E. Martin, who is the author. He's also the founder and chairman of MCAM Incorporated and the architect and founder of the Global Innovation Commons. He also founded Mosaic Technologies. And he has a very impressive bio. He's been to 120 different countries. And I think I'm going to skip some of the bio because this incredible novel that he has written is also very autobiographical, and I would love to hear from him directly how much of the novel is his own story and how much of it is fiction. So, David, welcome to the show.
Carol, it's a delight to be back with you. Thank you very much for having me.
This novel that you have written, I have to ask, I know that I'm the only person who wrote a review on it on Amazon.com, and I have a feeling that the intention for the novel wasn't really to sell a bunch of books and reach out to the largest possible audience, but you had a different reason for writing it and putting this story together. And you say on the back cover that it is true. So can you tell me what your main purpose and intention was to write this novel and not just publish it, but you first posted it for free online?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You're exactly right. The novel itself was actually an effort that took a total of 8 weeks from start to finish to write, which when you pick it up, you sit there and kind of marvel at the fact that the document the size that it is was written so quickly. And I've told a number of people that the reason why it was so easy to write is because I didn't have to spend a lot of time coming up with characters or plots, because each one of the stories and each one of the characters and each one of the events that are detailed in the novel are things that actually have happened. They are, in fact, as they are described, set in settings where, in certain instances, there is an anonymity for the purpose of certain identities that, if one were to identify by name and by precise location, there was a risk. As we went through this process, there was a risk. We were advised that there would be the possibility for various libel claims and so forth. And as a result, there are moments where events were placed in slightly different locations. The sequence of events was placed in a time sequence that allows the anonymous reach of a direct assertion against a person for a crime or a set of crimes for which they've neither been indicted nor tried and convicted, can be appropriately shielded so that we're not making allegations that would cross the threshold of an individual laying claim to a libel problem. But it is important to realize that not only are the events and locations all part of an actual series of events, but probably more important, the reason why the novel was written and the reason why the novel needed to come out was a series of public statements being made by government officials, probably most notably the transition between Leon Panetta's service as the head of the CIA as he moved over into the Defense Department, where a number of the things that he was saying were quite alarming for anybody listening who is informed of some of the history of both the agency and the Defense Department. Because as he was making the transition through the spring into the summer, there was an enormous amount of public attention being paid to the electronic and cyber threats facing the United States. And there is a very particular concern that I've had for some time, based on a number of pieces of data that we've collected over the last few years, where we were greatly concerned that there would be an event that could very well be done and perpetrated by assets of the United States, which would be labeled as an attack from a foreign source or a series of foreign sources that would materially alter the financial records of the country. Mm-hmm. And we decided that it would be an appropriate thing to do to publish the novel in time to disrupt the moment in time when we felt there was a reasonably high probability that type of attack was about to happen. And the good news for all of us is that we were able to track the free downloads that were being taken off of the web when we first posted the book. The good news is many of the people who we know were involved in the possibility of planning and executing that scenario were early downloaders of the book. And so in many respects, I feel that I have the opportunity to have that wonderful sign that President Bush put up on the aircraft carrier inappropriately after the alleged end of primary conflict in Iraq when he said mission accomplished. The good news is we did, in fact, accomplish the mission that we wanted, which was to put the scenario into the public's view before the event could happen. And by doing so, we certainly disrupted the ease with which a foreign entity could have been blamed for a self-destructive act.
Okay. So the novel, it does look at you meeting some of these people who have decided to buy the presidency in 2008, who also had a hand in the events of September 11th, and it lays out actually 4 phases of a very criminal plot, and I'd say the largest financial heist in history. I don't know if that's. It seems it's quite an ambitious plot, and you detail some of these meetings and say that in essence this is true. Maybe not all the little details in the plot are true, but I want to ask you about how much you know about phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 of this plot, since you declined their offer to participate in it.
Well, that's a great question. And what has been the advantage that we've had, and this is an advantage that goes back to the late 1980s, when, while I was still in college, I was in Central America because the government of Costa Rica was looking for volunteers to come and assist them with the refugee influx during the latter stages of conflict during the Nicaraguan War. I took some time and went down, leaving the undergraduate campus I was attending in northern Indiana in a town called Goshen, Indiana. I went down into Central America and spent some time working on the Nicaraguan border in the Costa Rican Ministry of Health, working with refugees that were coming across the border. And it was during that time that I learned a very important thing. Some of your listeners probably recall Mel Gibson, I think it was, in the movie Air America, when you have these wonderful stories of people who are allegedly in the service of the country doing things that officially don't exist. And as you can remember, back in the middle and latter part of the 80s, there was a significant amount of activity going on in Central America and Nicaragua specifically, where the government of the United States was supporting illicit both drug and weapons deals in exchange for various political and other concessions in the conflicting parties in Nicaragua and throughout the majority of Central America. And while I was there, it became very clear that there are very few people in the clandestine services of the United States or our allies who are overly careful when they're out of the country. They frequently will speak quite freely. It's not atypical in the late 1980s to be on a beach in Costa Rica or any part of Central or Northern South America and encounter people from the drug enforcement agencies or the intelligence agencies of the United States and our allies, and it is not atypical for those individuals to speak rather freely. Mm-hmm. And during those times, one of the things that I became very interested in and acutely aware of was remembering names and places and conversations, and having lived in the area that was very near Somoza's land holdings, where the U.S. was basing a lot of what became the Iran-Contra operations, it was very easy to also go out and identify planes that were flying overhead, identify surface vehicles that were being used, and remember both the people in them and certain information about the cargo in them. Mm-hmm. And I maintained a record of those things, and so was interested in that. Mm-hmm. And then as time went on, coming through the 90s, I became very, very interested, certainly in the early 90s, in the way in which misinformation presumed that the people who were being told information that wasn't the case were counted on never traveling, never being able to independently corroborate any story. And it turned out that my work and my academic and my professional life took me to a number of the places where the evidence and the story didn't match. Mm-hmm. And so I had the opportunity through this process of learning a number of actors, learning a number of actions, and most importantly, learning a lot about how resources, logistics, people, and financing moves to support the covert actions of both our government and the covert actions of other governments.
But you never were actually, well, actually in the novel you talk about the U.S. government asking you to help them and to give them information. And,
that is correct.
And at the same time they were doing it to try to figure out what your methods were and not able to figure it out.
Well, there's an interesting paradox, and that was that back in the early 1990s, beginning actually in the very late 80s, but in the early 1990s, some of the technology that I developed for understanding unstructured data, which some of your listeners will know to be applicable in areas of cryptography and deciphering of signals, mm-hmm. became something that drew a significant amount of attention from a significant number of people around the world, not just our government, but a number of other places. And there is a particular type of technology that I developed which allows for the very detailed analysis of extremely large amounts of data and allows a deciphering of things that are hidden in plain sight, we like to refer to them as, mm-hmm. things where there are transactions, actors, and people who are doing things that think that they cannot be detected, but in fact what they're doing is detectable, and it's detectable in a kind of agnostic way, because what is being done is we use technology to detect anomalies in signals. Mm-hmm. The good news is that in certain instances we can find very bad actors doing very bad things, and we can report those very bad actions to the appropriate both legal and political structures that can intervene when appropriate. The problem with using an intelligent machine, however, is it doesn't know which organization or entity or transaction to turn a blind eye toward. Mm-hmm. And the unfortunate outcome of that was that very early on, we were detecting things that weren't supposed to ever be detected. And we made the mistake, or the beneficial response, depending on your point of view, of reporting those things to people who actually were part of the perpetrating bodies. And that's when we found out that the intelligence apparatus as we currently understand it, whether it's in the Pacific, whether it is in the North American region, whether it's in Europe or Asia, the intelligence apparatus does not want to have its secrets divulged. They're very interested in having the secrets of others cracked, but not its own. Mm-hmm. And when a machine is doing the intelligence to help sort through massive amounts of data, mm-hmm. it turns out that you find more than you are supposed to find, mm-hmm. which is what happened.
Okay. So your description in the novel of the shareholders and the different phases, how did you acquire that information, and do you think that is accurate?
Well, the actual proposition, which is the premise of the novel, which is that a group of private investors assembled to say that it was time that private investors rather than industrial incumbencies, bearing in mind that the presidency and the power of the United States has long been for sale. So the idea that somebody buys influence into the public sector or buys their way up to the top of the public sector is not neither novel nor a surprise to anyone. Mm-hmm. But the idea that someone would have the audacity to convene a meeting in New York where a number of private investors were invited to buy the interest in the overt purchasing of the presidency is a fact. That event actually happened, and that event was an event to which I was invited. I was invited to that event because, as I state in the novel, the impression was that to pull off what this particular group wanted to pull off, they needed to have the ability to detect the detectability of both asset transfers and other business transactions. And to do that, they wanted to enlist my support and the support of the technology that my company developed. That actually happened.
Okay. And then there's another meeting where later on in the novel where they lay out more details of the entire plot. It seems that in the first meeting, they're just told sort of partially what's going to happen, and they don't even know who's convening and who's offering them a stake in this, or who's manipulating them.
Correct. I think that that's one of the things that's been most fascinating over the last decade is that a number of people who I think in the public eye have a great deal of power and influence are themselves being acted upon. And one of the reasons as I went through life, and one of the reasons I try to maintain the posture that I do in the story, is to have a degree of humanity for people who think that they either have or are entitled to power, but having been thus seduced to be drawn into that illusion, mm-hmm. actually become actors in some respects very much against their will. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, in many of these instances, they have made personal decisions. They have jeopardized themselves. They've jeopardized other people within their circle of influence, their family, their colleagues, etc., where they don't have the option or they don't see a path towards an option of pulling the eject button. And so what happens is an enormous number of people who think that they are in positions of power and control arrive in their offices or arrive in their stations only to find out that they were set up and now they're a pawn in somebody else's game. And what happened was the game as it started was to acquire the most marketable candidate to win the presidency in 2008. Mm-hmm. And that was the business plan that was actually a written business plan. Mm-hmm. The tragedy was that as we went into the Bush and Cheney administration, it became very clear that there was an economic incentive to expand the plan from just taking a very active interest in the presidency to taking active interest in other places where the United States moved significant amounts of monetary resources with or without the overt accountability and visibility of the public. And so what you'll see as you go through a deeper analysis is that the individual shareholders became both beneficiaries on the contracting side because a lot of them owned or had interest in businesses that made out very well both before the September 11th events, but more importantly, some of the economic gains were more profound with respect to the anthrax attacks later in September. A huge number of people seem to forget that the month of September in 2001 was a month of terror, not just the 11th, but the anthrax situation that came on afterwards was actually a direct impact on more of the nation's population. For some reason, people seem to forget that.
Well,
but
I think
that particular event was, as we put it in the book, a component of a broader distraction to undermine the confidence of the public and to open up the possibility for radical erasures of civil liberties and erasure of a sense of individual accountability, because we were looking to have someone protect us from an anonymous someone else. And that impulse, which was critical for this stage, allowed many of the shareholders to step into places of significant financial wealth transfer, where the public authorized or stood idly by as the private sector enriched itself on this publicly funded fear.
Right. And okay, so that was basically phase one that was laid out in your novel, was the structural instability, the privacy erosion, critical to accessing the market data, and also accessing demographics to show how the public would respond to fear, government intrusion, and outside, events.
That's exactly right. That's why it's called the distraction. Okay. It was called the distraction. In the book, it's called the distraction. It was called the distraction because that's exactly what it was. It was meant not to galvanize a national response. Remember that in the wake of September 11th, if we go back and look at what the actual conditions of September 11th were, there was no hue and cry to go attack Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that that's allegedly where the hotbed of the enemy had come from. We didn't spend a lot of time galvanizing support to go attack parts of East Africa, despite the fact that the bombers of the Cole had been primarily trained and operationalized and supported from organizations in East Africa. What we did was we were told that it was time to spend an enormous amount of money. We were told that it was time to take out second mortgages of our homes, that the patriotic response to being hit was to leverage ourselves and leverage the homes that we lived in and leverage the employment we all had so that we could enrich a financial services sector in its efforts to expand the ability to move significant amounts of wealth. And if you stop and think about it and you sit there and say, well, why is it that in response to these horrific acts, our response was officially consume and indebt ourselves? That was the official policy response.
Well, that was the below the surface one though too, and that's your phase two where.
Well, but yeah, and that's the point. The point is that the distraction was what it was supposed to be, which was to give you the proximate cause to have an impulse, but the impulse itself was to activate the wealth transfer, which becomes the substance of the majority of the novel, which is how do you move epic layers of wealth from the public to a few private interests, and how do you do it while the public goes along with it all the way across the brink?
Well, then that leads to sort of phase three, which to me that seems like not just the financial crisis of 2008 and the bailouts, but I think the Fed bill recently revealed that over $16.6 trillion was doled out to major banks in the United States as well as banks abroad, and even more than that in currency swap agreements. So that was phase 3, right? Am I right in understanding that? Where it says,
well, indeed, as we move through the stages, the first stage was to destabilize the public and to essentially encourage the public to consume itself into debt and to relinquish its sense of personal and civic accountability, where we looked to the outside protector, if you will, to take care of us and expend inordinate amounts of money to defend us from this anonymous terror. The second part was the ability to wrest political control. And the third part was to arrest the real economic control. And that economic control, the seeds of which were laid in the authorizations that took place in the early 1990s, where we as a country were encouraged to take the homes and the other assets that we had and essentially use them as ATMs to support consumption, all the while having a monetary policy which was going unchecked in what really in many respects was the first time in modern human history where we've had a war effort that was not supported by productivity. We didn't have the munitions and the manufacturing and all of the things that, if you look back at the infrastructure developments around supporting the First and Second World Wars and even into the Korean War, where we had significant domestic employment to support the war effort. The domestic employment supporting the war effort this time around was in the service industry. It was in very large industries that were service-oriented, not service in active military sense, but service as in consulting, advising, security details, etc. And what you see is this very interesting fortuitous cycle where the money that was spent with major consulting firms, major government contracting firms, that money was used to prop up and inflate many housing markets around the country. So the intelligence and defense spends in places like Northern Virginia and Maryland and D.C., the spend that took place in the Northeastern Corridor, the spend that took place in Denver, a number of these places where significant value allegedly was appreciating in real estate, was also being supported by non-market compensation coming to people who were, at the end of the day, government contractors supporting the service-based economy around a service-based war. And that, unlike previous wars where there has been an industrial base being supported, increased the opacity of the ability for people to follow the money.
Well, we need to go for a break right now, David, but then we'll go back to what you to the novel and your own efforts to derail the plan and how successful it's been.
Indeed.
Okay.
I know she'll tell me where to start, and I trust my heart enough to follow through. I feel this feeling in my heart.
Hello, welcome back to Community Currency. I'm Carol Brouillet, and I'm speaking with Dr. David E. Martin, who is the author of Coup de 12, the enterprise that bought the presidency. And we were just talking about the different phases of this plot, and phase 3 was the systemic termination of phase 2 distractors once all the variables were aligned. And so this is, am I right in saying that was the controlled demolition of the economy starting in 2008 with the bailout and the election of Obama, as well as all the money that passed through the Fed?
Well, certainly it was the culminating act. I wouldn't say it was actually the beginning. It was in many respects the piece that was fully prepared. For those people who are not familiar with the structure of financial situations generally, and for those who are not familiar with the market activity that was running up to 2008, the crisis was not a crisis in 2008. The crisis was a fruit that harvested in 2008, but the seeds for that crisis were planted with a number of financial incentives, tax incentives, and financial products that were created and had a maturity date in 2008, which is the reason why the events are ascribed as a collapse in 2008. In fact, the amount of credit default swaps, which are these very interesting counterparty agreements between counterparties that are betting on the degree of risk and ultimately the degree of potential failure for both enterprises and governments. Credit default swaps that were growing throughout the middle and later part of the 2000s were trading in some instances above $1.4 trillion of value a day. Leading up to the crisis, there was, during the peak of the CDS trading volume, there was more than 5 times the global GDP in bets against humanity. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the alleged banking collapse of 2008, right, this is a situation where the mechanics of the process were all in place, and what 2008 really represents is the liquidating, cashing out, if you will, of the strategy for the systemic collapse of the U.S. economy and, for that matter, much of the G20 economy, where an enormous amount of wealth transfer took place, and it took place first under the auspices of the then outgoing Bush administration and was persisted and expanded under the Obama administration.
Mm-hmm. And I know that the major banks were most responsible for spreading the toxic assets throughout the world. Now, to me, from my perspective, it struck me that they were creating these massive debts, gambling debts, and then shifting them off the books of the people who created them onto the shoulders of the public so that they could privatize and seize, entire countries in the wake of the so-called, crisis. Is that accurate, or is that wrong?
Well, Carol, this is a place where one of the values of distractions is that people look at smoke and infer fire.
Okay.
And that's part of the reason why the novel does go into some detail around nature of how these transactions were built and who was actually involved. We have to realize that the nature of a lot of these bets, whether we're looking at collateralized mortgage obligations or whether we're looking at a number of other types of structured finance solutions, were not created by and were not held by banks. They, in fact, were, in many instances, the conveyors or the transactors or brokers of these things. Mm-hmm. But in many instances, the real market for these products was created by long-term investment-grade requirements with respect to asset purchases for enterprises like life insurance companies and like pensions. An enormous number of people overlook the fact that under the ERISA laws, which are the laws governing pensions, under banking and insurance reserve requirements, there is a requirement to manufacture a certain amount of fixed income products or debt-based products. Mm-hmm. And those products, which had historically been called risk-free investments, mm-hmm. they were treated as though they were cash equivalents in many instances. Those products were being required at an increasing demand, and there was no productivity that was supporting that demand. And so the manufacturing of very large instruments, many of them mortgage-backed securities or debt-backed securities, many of those products were manufactured to meet a statutory demand for industries that are required to purchase these debt instruments as part of their investment portfolio. And as we saw throughout the 2000s up into even the early part of this decade, we're seeing a number of foreign buyers who are losing their appetite for long-term sovereign debt were turning increasingly to structured finance. And it was not, in many instances, the large banks that were doing those structuring elements. It was the banks that were moving them. And when the collapse occurred, if you look back once again at the financial records, mm-hmm. it was companies like AIG, insurance companies, not banks. Mm-hmm. It was companies like AIG that had the significant exposures where large-scale counterparty transactions that did not have notional dollar value were paid off by the federal government at dollar-denominated value. And so that's the wealth transfer that is actually quite a bit larger than the fees and expenses that were generated by the banks moving these assets. And I think one of the critical things to understand is that even at present, where we have the Occupy Wall Street movement and a number of movements that are railing against banks as though they are the originators and the perpetrators, I think that there needs to be a bit more care and information in the minds of people to understand that the banking industry as a whole, for the last several years, has made its money on fees. It has not made its money on the business of banking. And those fees come from moving third-party products. And so once again, it's a very important part of any investigation process to find out where the source and the root of the situation is, not look at where the leaves are moving. Because the leaves are moving because that's what happens in the wind. But we really need to understand where the trunk of the tree and where the roots of the system are. And that's not, much to the surprise of a lot of people, sitting inside of the banks. It's actually sitting in a number of other places. But the banks often are involved in the movement of things, but often not involved with their creation.
Well, let's also look at phase 4. Is phase 4? This is the phase I think you described as trying to disrupt.
Yes.
With the novel, where it's the complete asset reallocation into the enterprise, and this is what you hope to achieve by posting this novel on the internet, so that they couldn't do this massive erasure. Now, can you explain about the technology that you describe in the novel and how much bearing that has on what you feared in the summer when you posted the novel?
Indeed. Many people are becoming aware because in the last 6 to 8 months, both our own government and several other governments are starting to speak more candidly about this. But for the past several years, one of the growing appropriations inside of the defense budget in the United States and the defense budgets of several of the other G20 countries, and for that matter, a great deal of research being done in the People's Republic of China, has to do with electromagnetic susceptibility and threats to both our power as well as to our financial grid from electromagnetic impulses. Now, electromagnetic impulses can be generated in a number of different ways. There are well-defined, well-documented and established programs that the Department of Energy has had for many years, that international interests have had, things like the HARP project, which is something that is a very well-documented technology that looks at ionospheric and tropospheric manipulation of electromagnetic and other spectral fields. There are a number of technologies that have to do with both atomic and non-atomic blast, EMP, which is electromagnetic pulses. And in the recent years, one of the things that we found quite interesting and we monitored very closely was the hardening, which is a term used to describe the process whereby you build a protective mechanism so that equipment exposed to electromagnetic impulses is protected. Mm-hmm. Hardening budgets were expanding in certain sectors of the government, but not in others. Mm. And we were quite interested in the fact that it seemed that an enormous number of the data supply to and the data management of financial data for the U.S. government was not being hardened to the same extent that defense technologies were. Mm-hmm. And what concerned us even more was the growing statements being made, and once again I'd refer listeners to the spring and summer public comments made by then CIA Director Leon Panetta and then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta on the fact that the greatest threats facing America were going to be likely cyber threats. And in those comments, he would talk about, on more than one occasion, the threats from electromagnetic pulses. Mm-hmm. Our big concern was that as we saw the consolidation of financial data, both Federal Reserve and Treasury data, being consolidated into a number of critical data centers, that we were seeing a threat level increase well past an acceptable normal threat level. And we were also reviewing an enormous number of internal documents which were being exchanged with various agencies with respect to the stability and the recovery of data at particularly Fed and Treasury data centers. And we started looking at whether those data centers were part of the hardening exercise, and we were seeing an enormous number of susceptibilities and vulnerabilities that were being described in a rather public forum. Mm-hmm. These are pieces of data that you don't have to look to find very hard. You can find them relatively easily. And that data was so alarming that we started to look at a series of data points that started triangulating around a series of contractors, federal contractors that were involved in a project that was looking at how to test the failover capacity or the catastrophic loss of data in data centers that hold significant amounts of the records of the financial transactions of the United States. And our concern was that there were very interesting grid, data center, and critical EMP or EMF exposure risks in the places where the data was being consolidated. This led us to the conclusion that the public statements that said that it was likely that the U.S. would be attacked using some form of electromagnetic pulse or EMF device, electromagnetic frequency device, was growing so much that it was essentially front-running the story, which would then build the enemy. And by the way, the enemies of choice in the speeches that were being made in Washington were countries like the Korean Peninsula, both north and south. People were talking about China. People were talking about Iran. In fact, people were talking about the Iranian nuclear program potentially creating a high-altitude nuclear device that would then allow the EMP to neutralize data in a large set of areas. And when you start going down the pathway of identifying the perpetrator ahead of an event, mm-hmm. it starts sounding a lot like what we had going up to the run-up to the Afghan, the Iraq, the 9/11, the anthrax situation. It starts looking like the same playbook, and so we started evaluating whether or not there were credible reasons why we should be concerned. And it turns out that we saw some susceptibilities, particularly around the data centers that control most of the financial data of this country. And when we started looking at whether those places were suitably protected to the level that the government has applied to defense and to the level that government has applied to other data areas, we found that there was a giant lack. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why we decided it was foolish not to counter the public saber rattling, where we were identifying who we thought the enemy of whoever would perpetrate an electromagnetic attack. We decided it would be appropriate to counter that saber rattling with the novel.
I feel this feeling in my heart. I know she